In the final years of the Second World War, the air above the Pacific trembled with the sound of engines, thousands of them roaring across skies once thought untouchable. Beneath those skies in the cold shipyards of America, a new kind of power was being forged, one that would alter the balance of the oceans forever. Japanese admirals, once masters of naval strategy and discipline, had prided themselves on precision, on centuries of warrior culture distilled into naval perfection. Yet as they stared across the endless sea of intelligence reports and reconnaissance photos, a single, haunting realization began to form. The enemy was building ships faster than they could sink them. In secret factories along the Gulf Coast, along the Mississippi River, and deep inside the industrial heartlands of America, the clanging of hammers never ceased. The world had never seen such production. These were not grand battleships or sleek cruisers. They were something humbler, more practical, yet infinitely more dangerous. The Americans called them LST's landing ship, tank. Flat-bottomed, massive, designed not for elegance but for purpose, to carry men, tanks, and supplies directly onto hostile shores. Between 1942 and 1945, the United States produced an astonishing 1,051 of these giants. For the Japanese admirals who had spent a lifetime studying warfare as an art, this was not art, this was industry as war. The contrast could not have been greater. On one side of the Pacific, Japanese shipyards clung to ancient rhythms, craftsmanship, ritual, and scarcity of resources. Each vessel was a masterpiece, built slowly with reverence. On the other side, the Americans had turned shipbuilding into an unstoppable machine. A ship was no longer a work of art, it was a product. Steel went in, ships came out. Every week, new LSTs slid down the ramps into the waters, each one a symbol of mechanical supremacy and relentless determination. To the admirals of the Imperial Japanese Navy, this was a nightmare they had not foreseen. They had studied tactics, not economics. They had mastered discipline, not mass production. As the war dragged on, reports from the front grew more desperate. American forces were landing everywhere from the beaches of Saipan to the jungles of the Philippines. Behind every landing came an army of steel, LSTs pouring supplies, tanks, and artillery onto the beaches with clockwork precision. Where the Japanese expected exhaustion, the Americans brought more strength. Where the Japanese expected fear, the Americans brought reinforcements. The admirals watched in silence as the tide of war shifted not through brilliance or strategy, but through sheer production. Every LST that touched a beach was a reminder. Japan was fighting a nation that could build faster than it could bleed. At the Naval Command in Tokyo, silence filled the war rooms. The maps stretched across tables were filled with red arrows, markers of lost territory, destroyed fleets, and defeated islands. Each marker carried the weight of thousands of lives, each red line the loss of another dream of empire. One admiral, his uniform pressed and medals gleaming with false pride, whispered words no one wanted to hear. "Gentlemen, they are building ships faster than we can count them." It was no longer a war of strategy. It had become a war of mathematics, tons of steel, gallons of fuel, and the endless might of American industry. For Japan, whose resources were bleeding out across the Pacific, there could be no recovery. Sound of typewriters, the hum of engines, distant American voices shouting over shipyard noise across the Pacific, in places like Evansville, Indiana, and Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Men and women worked around the clock. Housewives, factory boys, and retired mechanics, all part of an industrial army. They welded steel, hammered rivets, painted holes, and sent off new ships with flags and prayers. In just 3 years, the United States had transformed itself from a nation of consumers into an empire of producers. Each LST was not just a ship, it was a weapon of logistics, a floating bridge that carried America's war machine from one island to the next. The Japanese admirals had underestimated not just their enemy's firepower, but their willpower. They had imagined a long war of attrition, where skill and sacrifice might prevail. Instead, they found themselves facing a civilization that could replace what it lost in days, not years. Every time an LST was sunk, another took its place. Every loss Japan inflicted only sharpened America's resolve. By 1945, when the great island-hopping campaigns reached their peak, the Americans had built so many LSTs that the oceans themselves seemed filled with steel. For the Japanese high command, the realization came too late. Their fleets were broken, their air power crippled, their resources gone, and as they looked across the Pacific, they understood the war was no longer about courage or honor. It was about the cold, unstoppable arithmetic of industry. In those final days, as the sun set over the empire, one truth echoed across every harbor and every shattered shipyard. They had known everything about war except how to build for it. By 1944, the Pacific Ocean no longer belonged to Japan. Once, its admirals had looked upon the vast blue expanse as their empire's natural fortress, a domain protected by courage, discipline, and divine wind. But now, as the months of war turned into years, that proud blue had become a graveyard. The once mighty Imperial Navy, which had stunned the world at Pearl Harbor, was bleeding from 1,000 unseen wounds. American convoys moved like storms across the sea, carried by the very ships that Japan had failed to imagine, the LSTs. They were not elegant, these floating beasts. Built for utility, not for beauty, their shapes were square and their decks unrefined. Yet what they carried inside changed everything. Each one could bring an entire regiment, tanks, jeeps, artillery, fuel, food, and men, straight onto the beaches of islands once thought unreachable. No. In the old wars, armies had marched for months to meet their enemy. Now, in this new industrial age, war itself could arrive overnight, shipped in bulk, delivered in steel, and powered by engines that never slept. In Tokyo, the admirals watched with growing dread. Reports arrived from the Marianas, from Guam, from the Philippines. Each message carried the same pattern. Enemy landings successful. Heavy losses. LST presence overwhelming. Those 3 letters became a curse, whispered in the corridors of Command LST. For them, it meant the end of isolation, the end of distance as defense. The Pacific was no longer an ocean that protected Japan. It had become a highway for American invasion. The older officers, raised in the traditions of the samurai, refused to believe what they were seeing. They still imagined that courage could overcome machines, that will could defeat industry. But the war had changed. It was no longer fought by heroes with swords, but by workers with hammers. Every LST sliding into the Pacific from an American shipyard was another nail in Japan. Coffin built by hands that never saw the battlefield, but shaped its destiny nonetheless. Sound of welding torches and factory sirens blends with the rumble of thunder in the industrial heartland of America. Production never ceased. It was as if the land itself had become alive with the pulse of war. Steel mills roared. Shipyards burned through the night. The Mississippi River carried the newborn LSTs down toward the Gulf, where they would join the convoys bound for the Pacific. Entire towns turned into production lines. Children collected scrap metal. Housewives worked riveting guns. Farmers traded plows for wrenches. It was not just a nation fighting, it was an entire civilization mobilized for one purpose: victory. Every 3 days, another LST was born. Every week, another convoy left the ports, and for every ship Japan managed to sink, 10 more appeared in its place. The Japanese admirals stared at their dwindling resources, oil nearly gone, steel supplies strangled by blockade, shipyards bombed to ashes. Their submarines could no longer hunt. Their destroyers, once the pride of the Navy, sat idle for lack of fuel. And all the while, across the ocean, the United States was feeding an empire of steel. Sound of American radio news fades in softly, ... And today, another record has been broken in the Evansville shipyard. The 500th LST has rolled into the water, ... Each headline was a blow to Japanese morale. The Americans celebrated their factories as if they were battlefields. Workers cheered as new ships slid into the water, bands played, flags waved. While the Japanese soldiers starved on remote islands, American workers were eating sandwiches beside the machines that forged victory. It was a contrast too vast for any general to comprehend. A war where the real front lines were not in the jungles of the Pacific, but in the furnaces of Detroit and Pittsburgh. The LSTs became the backbone of every assault. Tarawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. They carried the tanks that crushed Japanese fortifications, the supplies that fed American soldiers, and the wounded who would live to fight again. On each beach, their metal ramps dropped like the opening jaws of some mechanical beast. And from their bellies poured the unstoppable tide of war. Japanese soldiers, brave and desperate, fought to the last breath, but courage, no matter how pure, cannot stop steel. By mid-1945, the Imperial Navy was little more than a ghost fleet. Its great battleships, the Yamato, the Musashi, once symbols of invincible power, were now hunted and destroyed by aircraft, launched from American carriers supported by LSTs below. Even as Japan's leaders clung to dreams of negotiation, their empire was collapsing under the weight of American production. The Japanese admirals gathered in dimly lit war rooms, staring at maps that no longer meant anything. The Pacific had turned red with their defeats. Every LST launched from an American harbor was another step toward Tokyo Bay. One by one, the admirals came to the same grim truth. They had not just lost a war. They had been outbuilt, outproduced, outlasted. The sound fades to silence then. Slowly, the ticking of a clock. The narrator's voice returns, quieter now. Almost a whisper. History would remember their brilliance, their precision, their discipline. But it would also remember their blindness. The Japanese high command had built their empire on tradition, not technology, on honor, not industry. And in the end, it was not the bombs or bullets that defeated them, but the relentless rhythm of American factories, the heartbeat of a nation that had turned steel into victory.